The month of April is fast approaching, and in case you were not aware, April is Fair Housing Month. If you are involved in real estate in any way and are not aware of what the federal fair housing law is, then I recommend that you go research that as soon as this podcast is over. The fair housing law is a law that prohibits rental owners, property managers, real estate agents, landlords, etc. from discriminating against specific groups of people in any aspect of the real estate business. That includes, but is not limited to, advertising, screening, rental leasing practices, etc. But believe it or not, some people aren't required to comply with fair housing legislation. The federal fair housing law does have some exemptions for specific scenarios where the law is not applicable. And many people aren't quite clear on whether or not they specifically are required to follow the federal fair housing law. We'll provide some clarity on that question in just a second. Let's get started. Hi everybody, my name is Chris, and I want to thank you for joining us for another value-packed TenantCloud podcast. If you want to be a more informed, better educated, and successful landlord, then stay tuned. With over a decade of property management experience, we bring you short and sweet, bite-sized pieces of incredibly valuable property management tidbits in 15 minutes or less. So the first question to cover, and it's essential to this conversation around the fair housing law, is what is the purpose of the fair housing law? The fair housing law was passed during 1968, and the objective of it was and is to eliminate discriminatory practices in the realm of real estate, whether that is renting or buying or whatever it may be. The central objective was to prohibit race discrimination in the sale and rental of housing. That includes prohibiting the dissemination of false information about the availability of housing, such as improperly telling someone that something is not available or steering people who are looking to buy in certain neighborhoods based on their race. And since then, it has evolved to try to eliminate discrimination based on all kinds of things, including disability, religion, and familial status. And by familial status, I mean it typically refers to a family with kids, because a lot of rental properties back in the day used to discriminate against families with kids. A lot of rental buildings would specifically state if you have kids, you can't rent there. And so it really put a lot of families in a very poor position and with not many options for places to rent. And so that is a basic recap and a basic summary of what the fair housing law is and what its intention is for what it's trying to accomplish. So when is the fair housing law applicable, the federal fair housing law? Well, it's applicable in selling or renting real estate. It is applicable in brokering or appraising real estate. It is applicable for providing financial assistance for buyers or renters of real estate, for participating in any type of real estate organization, intimidating, coercing, threatening, any of that in regard to a purchase or a rental of real estate property, or interfering in general with a person's right of enjoyment and use of housing rights based on discriminatory reasons for things like we discussed: race, color, disability, religion, sex, familial status, or national origin. So it covers a broad range of things and ways that you could discriminate against somebody. And so it's extremely important that you are familiar with and are up to date and up to speed on not only the federal fair housing law, but also on state fair housing laws, which often expand on the federal fair housing law. So what are some examples of some exemptions from the fair housing law? That's what we're trying to get to here, is in what scenarios are you not actually held to the federal fair housing law? Now, this podcast is not to suggest that you should try to operate outside of the federal fair housing law, because I don't think that there's anything wrong with the federal fair housing law. I don't think anybody thinks that there's anything wrong with the federal fair housing law. I think that it is a good law that helped solve a lot of problems when it came to real estate. But there are some scenarios in which you just need to know if you need to really be paying attention to this law when it comes to your specific rental, and make sure that you're following all the ins and outs of the law. And that's why I encourage you to become familiar with not just the federal fair housing law, but the state fair housing laws, because there are some small ways in which you need to make sure that you're following every part of the law to the T, because there are some serious repercussions for violating the fair housing laws. So some examples of exemptions from the fair housing law may be a single family home, as long as the home is also rented or sold by the owner, and the owner does not own more than 3 homes at the time, and advertising for the sale or rental was not discriminatory, and the owner did not use a real estate agent or broker. So that's a lot going on there. But again, single family homes, as long as the home is also rented or sold by the owner does not own more than 3 homes at the time, and the advertising for the sale or the rental was not discriminatory, and the owner did not use a real estate agent or broker to conduct the transaction. So this scenario is very rare, so it's very rare that this would be applicable to anybody probably even listening to this podcast. The second scenario in which you are exempt from the fair housing law is potentially if the rooms or units in a building with a maximum of 4 units, as long as the owner, the owner, lives in one of the units. So if you have a fourplex and you are living in one of the units, and the building only has those 4 units, and you're living in there, then you are exempt from the fair housing law in that specific scenario. Rooms or units owned directly or indirectly by a religious organization, as long as preference is only given on the basis of that membership, and membership in that religion is also not restricted by race, color, or nationality. So again, if it is a church that owns the units directly or indirectly, and as long as preference is based on membership of that religious organization, and the membership of that religion is not discriminatory, so anybody can join that specific religion or that religious organization. And then the last one is rooms or units owned by a private organization for non-commercial use, as long as preference is only given on the basis of membership, and again, membership in that organization is not restricted by race, color, or nationality. So there, you can see there are some scenarios here in which the fair housing law does have exemptions for protection reasons for specific other groups, such as religious organizations, private organizations, as well as for small single-family home renters in cases where there's very unique circumstances surrounding that specific rental. So, again, I don't recommend that you violate any of the federal fair housing law rules, even if you are exempt from it, just because it is a great law, in my opinion. And regardless of the federal exemptions, you also have to pay attention to local and state jurisdictions, because they often have their own fair housing laws, often with additional protected classes and different exemptions. And so it's not just enough to follow the federal fair housing laws and whether you're exempt from them. You also have to make sure that you're actually exempt from your local and state fair housing laws, which expanded on the federal ones. For example, California, their fair housing law essentially covers any form of housing if it's described as a quote-unquote business establishment. And that term has been interpreted by courts very broadly to include just about every type of housing. And so pretty much in the state of California, you're not exempt from anything. There is no scenario in which you are exempt from any federal fair housing law or any fair housing law in the state of California in general. So again, even if you are exempt under state or federal fair housing laws, those laws were enacted for a specific reason to prevent discrimination in the provision of shelter. And shelter, a roof over your head, that's a basic human need similar to water and food. And so it's important that unless you have a very specific scenario in which, again, you're a religious organization or something of that nature, then it's very important that you follow these federal fair housing laws and state fair housing laws, even if you're exempt from them. As always, the information provided on this podcast is for informational purposes only, and under no circumstances whatsoever should it be considered legal advice. If you have any particular questions or issues regarding this topic, you definitely want to consult with an attorney. As always, thank you for taking the time out of your busy schedule to listen to this TenantCloud podcast. We hope that you have found value in the time that you have spent listening to it, and if so, feel free to share this episode with any friends, colleagues, or family members who you believe may benefit from the information that we've discussed. You can also read our blogs at tenantcloud.com/blog, or you can listen to this podcast on any platform such as Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Spotify, Stitcher, etc. Or you can check us out on the TenantCloud YouTube channel. Just type in TenantCloud YouTube channel on Google and you'll find our full system demos, webinars, and other media content there. As always, thank you again for listening, and we will look forward to talking with you next time.